Honorable President, distinguished representatives. It is an honor to appear before the Human Rights Council to present my report on documentation of gross violations of human rights and serious violations of international humanitarian law, as well as the addendum on my country visit to Brazil. In my annual report, I highlight the activities carried out over the past year and inform about the status of country visits planned and requested. I would like to take this opportunity to express my gratitude to Brazil for welcoming me on an official visit and for their exceptional cooperation, as well as to Guatemala, the Marshall Islands, and Nepal for extending invitations to visit in 2025 and 2026. I regret that the restrictions placed on the availability of the regular budget prevented the organization of a second country visit in the reporting period, and hope to be able to schedule the visit agreed upon as soon as possible, subject to the availability of funds. I would also like to inform that next year I will devote my thematic reports to addressing the challenges of negationism, revisionism, and politicization of transitional justice, as well as the question of emerging technologies in the context of transitional justice. Mr. President, Excellencies, this year's thematic report examines the expectations, state of affairs, and lessons learned concerning the collection, mapping, recording, preservation, and archiving of information, evidence, and testimonies of gross violations of human rights and serious violations of international humanitarian law. The comprehensive documentation of such violations is crucial for the successful implementation of transitional justice mechanisms. Adequate documentation supports positive outcomes in the implementation of truth-seeking initiatives, the search for the missing persons, accountability processes, and reparation programs. It also helps maintain accurate accounts of past violations, thus promoting mutual understanding and preventing possible distortions of historical facts, which in turn furthers peace and reconciliation. International law places a duty on states to investigate and elucidate the truth about serious human rights violations, as well as to preserve evidence and archives, memorialize, and prevent the development of denialist themes about them. To fulfill these duties and adequately support transitional justice aims, documentation processes must be prompt, comprehensive, inclusive, participatory, context-specific, victim-centered, and gender-sensitive. The adoption and discharge of adequate documentation processes ensure the legitimacy, credibility, and coherence of transitional justice measures and the veracity of the information on which they are based, thus providing a solid foundation for the transitional justice system and a powerful antidote against the manipulation of historical facts, which can lead to the resurgence of social divides and violence. Excellencies, although the information generated by documentation initiatives constitutes the backbone of many transitional justice processes, they are rarely prioritized and is often overlooked in the design, financing, implementation, and monitoring of transitional justice systems. This can lead to serious failings in national processes to deal with past abuses, such as reports from truth commissions that present an incomplete depiction of the scale and breadth of human rights violations, stunted criminal investigations, reparation programs that exclude entire categories of victims, and negationist memorialization processes that foster division and risk the recurrence of violence. Faced with state inaction, civil society frequently takes a leading role advancing documentation efforts, but lacks adequate backing from donors and other actors. The report points to the concerning challenges observed in documentation as a result of inadequate investment and attention to this matter, including, firstly, the insufficient recording and mapping of gross human rights violations and the insufficient collection of testimonies of victims and witnesses, the lack of measures to safeguard evidence and information about these violations, the deliberate and or unintended destruction or tampering of documentation relating to these violations, Delayed documentation, which leads to the loss of evidence and testimony due to the passage of time or exposure to extrinsic factors, such as emergencies or natural disasters. The impeded access to records of these violations due to restrictions or obstacles imposed deliberately or sometimes inadvertently by states, international organizations, and non-state actors. Serious capacity and resource constraints of national, international, and civil society actors engaged in documentation efforts, and inadequate safety measures to protect victims and witnesses who can provide testimony and evidence of these violations. Excellencies, documentation has received limited attention in transitional justice processes. At the same time, the importance and effectiveness of documentation processes are increasing due to the availability of new technologies and methods that facilitate the collection and analysis of information. The international community has begun to recognize the importance of documentation efforts and decided to establish international investigative mechanisms in certain contexts. However, in most transitional justice contexts, documentation is still an afterthought for national and international actors. I call on states, the international community, and donor institutions to ensure that processes of documentation of serious human rights violations are integrated as a core element of transitional justice strategies, and that commensurate material and human resources are assigned to this task. I recall that this should not be perceived solely as a technical exercise, but as a human rights imperative and a prerequisite for realization of truth, justice, reparation, memorialization, and non-recurrence. My report offers concrete guidance for states, civil society partners, and international actors to ensure that documentation is adequately embedded in transitional justice processes from the inception to completion. I invite you to examine and implement these recommendations. Mr. President, Excellencies, I would like now to address the report on the country visit to Brazil that I carried out from 30th March to 7 April 2025, to assess the measures adopted by the government to address the serious human rights violations committed during the dictatorship from 1964 to 1985. In the report, I underscore the positive initiatives identified in the fields of truth-seeking, reparation, and memorialization, particularly the work carried out by the Special Commission on Political Deaths and Disappearances, the Amnesty Commission, and the National Truth Commission. I note, nonetheless, that their restricted mandates affected the scope, particularly regarding the categories of victims addressed. On the other hand, I express serious concerns about the lack of criminal accountability for serious human rights violations committed in this period, particularly as a result of the application of the Amnesty Law of 1979. The failure to address the incompatibility of this law with Brazil's human rights obligations remains a core barrier to truth, justice, reparation, and guarantees of non-recurrence in Brazil. The lack of legal consequences for past abuses has reinforced a culture of impunity and established conditions for repetition. This challenge is compounded by the insufficiency of security sector reforms, the concerning militarization of education in certain parts of the country, and the lack of history teaching about the dictatorship in some states. The lack of a comprehensive transitional justice process to deal with the aftermath of the dictatorship has regrettably led to the recurrent attacks on democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. The alleged coup attempt of January 2023 and the continuity of state violence against marginalized groups demonstrate the dangerous effects of an incomplete transitional justice model and the urgent need to settle accounts with the past to avoid recurrence. To correct this path, Brazil must urgently implement the transitional justice package proposed in the final report of the National Truth Commission and the recommendations contained in my report. Excellencies, I would like to take this opportunity to unconditionally denounce the United States government's sanctions against the Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories. I express my full solidarity with my colleague. Sanctioning a special rapporteur appointed by the Human Rights Council violates international law and is a direct attack on the integrity of the human rights system, including special procedures as a whole. I call on all states to act decisively to denounce these sanctions and refuse to carry them out. I also call on the United States to immediately withdraw these illegal sanctions. With this, I conclude my presentation today. I remain at your disposal for questions and comments during the interactive dialogue that will follow. Thank you.